Hello and welcome this lovely Friday lunchtime from the Property Marketing Strategists. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Deanie. And we feel really privileged to bringing you this webinar in partnership with Housing Hand. And thank you all for joining us this Friday lunchtime. Hopefully you've all seen that Housing Hand recently launched a report which was based on a survey to 1,700 renters and also a focus group to understand what renters do and don't understand about the rental process. I'm sure you'll agree that the findings were not only fascinating but also shocking and a little bit concerning in places. But on the positive side, Graham, Danny and our expert panellists are here today to look forward and rally the sector into helping and supporting tenants moving forward. Before we get on with discussion, it'd be great if we can just go round our virtual table and everyone introduce themselves. So Graham, if I can come to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Graham Hayward. I'm Managing Director of Housing Hand. I think that says enough.
That's great. Thank you, Graham. And Danny?
Yeah, perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. So my name is Danny Smith and I'm the sales manager at Housing Hand. So I lead our team of account managers and I'm responsible for onboarding new clients as well as maintaining and developing existing clients, which usually include accommodation partners, universities, booking platforms, pretty much anyone and everyone in the sector. So it's a pleasure to be here today and I'm looking forward to sharing insights and engaging with some of you throughout the session.
Lovely. Thank you, Danny. And Adam?
Yeah, I'm Adam. I'm the sales manager at Coapt. We are a sales and lettings agency based in sunny Brighton. It's very sunny today, in fact. We obviously are private market specialists, private accommodation. We are predominantly a student agency as well. We let and manage about 500 student properties. And obviously being that middleman between landlords and tenants, which is quite an interesting position to be in at the moment. It's amazing how much education you need to give on both parts of that equation.
That's great. Thank you, Adam. And Nick?
Hi everyone, so I'm Nick Ems. I'm from Accommodation for Students, so Accommodation for Students, student accommodation portal. My main role, I cover a number of different areas within the business, but mostly focused on marketing, business development and customer services.
That's great. Thank you. Obviously, we're going to have a couple of questions for the panel, but we would love your questions if you are watching. So please do place them in the Q&A and we will put them to the panel throughout the session as and when we can. I will now pass it over to Sarah, who's going to get the discussion started.
Thank you, Deanie. And first of all, just want to say congratulations to Graham, Danny and the Housing Hand team on producing this great report. I know that I've been thoroughly digesting it over the last few weeks and found it really, really useful. But in case anybody hasn't looked as thoroughly at the data as I have, just want to pull out some of those key findings. So what we found when we read it is that only 5% of renters feel confident in the process of renting. And it was concerning to see that 25% felt overwhelmed, 22% uncertain and 21% anxious. We know that moving is a really, really stressful time, but we would have hoped that there would have been a little bit more on the positive words such as, excited and happy, but we weren't really seeing that. I know Nick and the team at Accommodation for Students, you've done a bit of research as well with students when asking them to sum up the most recent experience of renting in one word. What did you make of the report, Nick, and how did it kind of compare with what you found as well?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So firstly, I thought the Housing Hand report was excellent, and it was really good to see the voice of the student, particularly in relation to the Renters' Rights Act. In terms of kind of areas of alignment, if you like, a lot of the feedback that we got for students in our survey was around this kind of feeling stressed when looking for student accommodation. So 53% of students found it a very sort of stressful process and not something that they were looking forward to. So I think that theme comes across really strongly. And just before I came on, I was kind of looking at both reports, and I think the other area that really stood out for me was students were sort of they were explaining to us about what they wanted to see changed, and it was this kind of process of communication, how they're communicated to by different parties within the student accommodation sector, and also getting the information they need. And I think that those were the sort of two sort of areas really that seem to be closely aligned.
Thank you, Nick. And also, Adam, how does that kind of resonate with you? You're seeing a lot of tenants kind of face to face, as well as obviously your team talking about, to them over the phone. Are you getting that kind of sense of stress and overwhelm as well?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's always been the case, but I think it's even more prevalent now. And I think, being student facing, it's our team that faces a lot of those questions and anxieties head on. We meet those tenants face to face, and it's amazing the number of questions we get, not just the way they're phrased, but some of them seem, obviously we're property professionals, so they seem quite surprising to us in their simplicity sometimes. And I think it's particularly noticeable for us as well, being an agency. I think it's a really important transition for those students to moving from being in lower level education and then sort of, dare I say it, moving into the adult world for the first time, maybe moving from university provided accommodation where it's all very handheld and the service is there to help the students, into the wider world where accommodation is business orientated, dare I say it. And I think the students sort of pick up on the fact that it's not everyone's there to help them anymore necessarily, and everyone's got ulterior motives. So it's really interesting to have those conversations, answer those questions, but also just try and offer reassurance. That's almost the largest part of our job now, is giving students reassurance that they're making the right decisions or they don't need to be worried about it.
Yeah, and Adam, just jumping into that, I think that whole part about students leaving home, and I know our balance is about 90% of our clients are students, 10% are working professionals, but students stepping away from home, getting that freedom, if you like, comes with a lot of insecurity as well. And when you start to get into what we all try to do, I think, is have the right legal structure and the right formalities around engaging people, but many of them don't understand that, and that for me resonated out of the survey particularly, that they don't understand what they're necessarily getting into. And that's before, as you quite rightly point out, Adam, that's before renters' rights even starts to get traction.
Yeah, I think one thing I found really useful, Graham, actually, with your report was, because we always look at it from a student perspective, and I thought what was really helpful was within the report you can compare kind of students to non-students and the difference. So it was really interesting to me, when it comes to this point about understanding how to sort of terminate a contract, if you like, that students understand that process less well than working professionals, which kind of makes sense. So I thought that was also really handy information, actually, in good context.
Yeah, and there's something that I guess personally I tend to use, which is something called the taxi rule, right? And we all get into a taxi, right, and take us to a place, but we only pay when we get out, and it's that mentality of just trying to understand, I'm getting into this thing, but what is the cost of getting out? And so how you terminate, the rules of termination, joint and several obligations, it's quite a minefield.
I mean, Graham, at Housing Hand, you wanted to do this report.
Yes.
Is that because you suspected this might be what you found, or were you kind of open-minded to be kind of proved wrong?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, you hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, we wanted to do the survey because we're passionate about trying to make sure that people are getting the property that they want, and that's where the guarantor part is assisting them, but also keeping the property that they've acquired. Right, as a guarantor, we help them on that journey, and then at the back end of it. So Danny, I'm sure, has got a lot more insight that I'm going to share. Of people coming to us with all these questions up front. So I think we inherently knew that there was a challenge. Right. And really the reason that the survey all came about was because, we could see this collision almost, right, of the renters' rights, and even for professionals such as us, we invest heavily in trying to understand it as it's moving around, and it's only just finished the Lord's process or coming to the end of that. So almost home, but it's quite complex, and this is a massive change. So those two things colliding, we know we're going to cause a bit of an issue. So part of our outreach and wanting to do the survey was to just quantify that. So, and we've even spoken to Ministry of Housing around it and their communications team, to say, look, we think there's a lot more to be done around this, and we're quite happy to lead as much as we can from our perspective.
Yeah, Graham, I think, would it be fair to say, I think we're all probably quite, not necessarily surprised, but the results were quite startling. But I think we could almost assume it might even get worse to a degree. The rights bill is just going to throw even more confusion into the pan. As you said, even agencies and providers are sort of chewing through the facts and speculating how things are going to change. But for students, they're sort of getting second, third-hand information that isn't necessarily set in stone. So actually, the report's quite startling already in the results, but actually we're probably going further in that direction as well.
Yeah, and even more, Adam, building on that, one thing that I was discovering as we went through this was that, because, the way that the bill, and don't necessarily need to drill into that too much, the way that the bill is structured, it seems to say, that obviously PBSAs, purpose-built student accommodation, are largely going to be exempt from a lot of the bill, right? But the reality is that they're going to have to sign up to a code, and there's 3 code providers that they can sign up to, all of which have different criteria. So if I was already confused as a student or working professional, I mean, students clearly are PBSAs, and I'm now going to have to try and find out, well, which code and what terms and conditions are you signed up to, because it might be different to my friend going to a different PBSA.
I think what came out of the report as well was, I guess the first question was, how literate do the renters think they are about kind of the rental process, and 73% said they were. You then delve a little bit deeper and 34% didn't know what a guarantor was before they started using one. 46% didn't know what a deposit protection scheme is. 58% didn't know what they would do if they didn't, they couldn't pay the rent. So there's a lot of evidence to assume that they think they know and understand the process, but actually the reality is they don't. And Danny, you deal, you're in business development, you deal with accommodation providers all the time. Are they showing any sort of kind of concern or recognition that maybe their tenants aren't as literate as they thought they would be?
I think that's a really, really good point. And I think the key takeaway from that is that sometimes, because we work in this industry and we're so clued up and we know what guarantors are, we know how to protect deposits and what notice periods are, because a lot of us have been doing this for such a long time, it's easy to forget that the average tenant doesn't know this information, but specifically students. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier on, but if a student has been living with their parents their whole life, this is a completely different world to them. So sometimes I think it's our duty and it's our responsibility to give them the facts that they actually need, and internationals as well, and obviously evidently from the survey findings, young professionals and average professionals as well. I think everybody in the sector just needs to come up with a plan, whether it's making on board impacts, where it explains this information, because I think it can be, even for a renter. I mean, I'm personally actually trying to find a property for myself at the moment. And there's been times where I've actually called up for a property, and I've called it up the same day it's gone on Rightmove, and the accommodations come back and said, literally, we've already had 50 applicants ready for a viewing. So it can be very difficult for a renter. And by the time they might actually find a property, they might think, oh, I don't care about the details, I just want to get in. And then obviously they rush into getting into a tenancy without actually checking out all of these little details that might affect them later on. So yeah, I think as a whole, the whole sector needs to get more involved in educating the tenants.
I think it's quite an irony, isn't it, that obviously the things we're talking about, deposit protection, services like Housing Hand, which are fantastic, and the Renters' Rights Bill, the main premise of the Renters' Rights Bill, all these things are in place to help the tenants. That's the direction the sector's moving in, and it's these elements that they're not clued up on, which is quite you know, it's really ironic, really. These things are to make the sector fairer for those tenants, and they're the ones who are falling further behind, according to the report, on the knowledge base on it, which is a crying shame, because you know some of these clauses, whether they're put in place in the right way, could be debated. But ultimately, tenants should be rejoicing about the way the sector's moving, or at least the mindset behind it. But unfortunately, we're going in the other direction
Totally
in
right,
that
Adam.
mindset.
Yeah, no,
There's a
couldn't agree
bit of a
more.
misalignment.
Yeah.
I think
One of
the
the-
other thing that a lot of, I mean, you probably see this, Adam, in your letting agency, that a lot of young people rely on family members, parents, etc., to give them that advice. But because the tenancy rules are changing, it's like that advice isn't going to be valid anymore. You know, this whole new cohort of renters needs to find that information out themselves. Graham, you already touched on it, and you know, talked about accreditation schemes and the government. But you know, who is responsible for giving renters the information that they need? I think, Nick, your research said that students particularly want a centralised, you know, platform.
Yes.
They want one source of truth. But you know, who is responsible for that? Is it universities? Is it the government? Is it, you know, another body? Is it parents?
Sarah, look, I think the answer to that question is yes. You know, is all of those parties. The challenge is, and I think from the survey, one of the interesting things which we shared with the government, right, was that they trust the government source, right, but they found it incredibly complex to get to the answer they wanted. So, you know, presenting clear information, right, which answers the basic questions and structures of things that you want, right, even on the government website, is currently quite all over the place. And we don't typically, because, you know, even on this call, we're coming at this from different angles. You know, we all have different terms and conditions and advice to clients, because, you know, we're coming at it from different angles. Now, commercially, that's fair, right? But actually, you know, ethically, you know, I think we do have to get towards a more consistent standard communication, you know, just to call out these differences that are there, you know, rather than, well, I'm more into joint and several tenancies, you know, so, you know, I'm going to go down that path, and I don't necessarily want to talk about the liability of that or how you get in and out of it, you know, because I'm trying to sell something.
Yeah, I think it's right. I mean, we talked about it briefly before the call. I think we've all got to take a bit of responsibility, really, Sarah. I think, and that's one of the things that's on my mind at the moment, is how do we effectively communicate this and make sure that students are aware of what the changes mean for them, because we do get an awful lot of questions currently, and just a real nugget in the Housing Hand report, and I think it was from a focus group. And it was a story about an international student who hadn't realised that if they left their tenancy early, they would be liable for 9 months of rent. You know, so that's, you know, under current circumstances, of course, but just making sure that students really understand what their rights and responsibilities are, and being really clear about it. It's going to be vital.
I mean, that's a really important point you just brought up, Nick, is international students and international renters. You know, it's complicated enough for people who have lived in this country, you know, all their lives and have been through the process, but it must be absolutely, you know, mind-boggling for somebody to come, you know, I can't imagine going to another country and working out their rental system. So it must be, you know, very, very overwhelming here. And I guess when we're thinking about that source of truth, we have to be considering people that English isn't a native language, they're not used to the process. How do they access that information as well? And you know, we're kind of saying that maybe universities, colleges, schools should provide more information, but we're really, if we're saying that, we're really talking about in this country. You know, we can't expect, you know, colleges, universities internationally all over the world to, you know, educate their students on, you know, the highs and lows of the rental process in the UK, really. So it does come back to a really, really accessible, simple source of information that can be, you know, accessed, translated in kind of all languages, really. Adam, I know that you're in Brighton, as you said. Do you come across international students kind of coming into your office? Is that, you know, are they coming to you for help and support?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely, we speak about that lack of knowledge of the industry. I think it definitely extends even more with international students, and you can understand why, because if there's also a language barrier, us Brits in the UK get confused by it, let alone if you're also moving to a country for the first time, you're worried about actually getting here in the first place, visas, all these kind of things. I don't feel I really feel for those people. We've had tenants show up in our office with their bags packed, ready to move in, and actually references aren't back. There's so much still to do. They haven't got right to rent checks. There's so much. Yeah, it's a real challenge. I think, we all forget there is actually a government guide for renting, the How to Rent guide, that has to be issued with a new tenancy. That should be that manual for it, but we're talking about it as if it's not there because basically it doesn't serve the purpose. Sorry, go on, Danny.
But yeah, no, I was going to say, just adding on from that as well, you mentioned the government have got obviously websites where it does have a lot of information in, but also tenancy agreements. Now, for an average student or a young professional, how easy are these agreements and these legal terms and conditions for the average person to read? I mean, especially if you're international and English isn't your first language. Yeah. I've read tenancy agreements before, and I've had to go and check with colleagues and say, what the hell does that mean? So I can only understand how difficult it must be for a student trying to navigate those processes, and especially actually picking out the parts that they're looking for, because sometimes these things are like 10-page documents. So trying to find the information that you need, it's quite easy to just sign an agreement and not actually look at what you're signing. And I think that is a problem. What you touched on earlier when you mentioned obviously a student not being able, not realizing that they was liable for the full rent after they'd left the property. I mean, I'm sure that could have easily have been avoided if they actually read through the terms and conditions. But obviously it's not as easy as that for everybody.
Yeah, and getting on to more, because it's very easy, I think, and the report is, I wouldn't say quite damning, but it's certainly not encouraging, right, about the current state that we're starting from. One of the things that we've literally just launched at Housing Hand is as in our external interface with clients, we've moved that, and I'm sort of smiling at Danny here because she's been a big part of getting a lot of this right. Is that we moved it into a digital interface where people can get information, but more importantly, they can get it at any time of the day or night, and they can do it in any language. Now that's really focused on what we do, right? But that technology and that ability is out there, but we're not looking at this from a what's in a AST or whatever it's called going forward, or the legal agreements and what they mean. The technology is there to do it. It just needs the effort to start to put it together.
I guess the pressure is there, and what Danny spoke about earlier is that all of this takes time. The reading the tenancy agreement, the looking for information, the asking the questions, knowing what questions to ask. And when young people are under pressure and there's a housing, there's a shortage of places to rent and they're being pressurized to sign agreements really, really quickly, you can see how these things are missed. We started to talk about the Renters' Rights Bill when we started this conversation, and I think it's meant to be there to protect the renter. It says what it is, but when the Housing Hand report came out, it showed that very few people had heard of the Renters' Rights Bill. 69% hadn't heard of it at all. Of those that had heard, 75% didn't know how it was going to impact them. We are in a bubble. We've lived and breathed this Renters' Rights Bill and the Renters Reform Act before that, and we followed the process, but I'm not really surprised that the public aren't aware of it, and I'd like to think that when it's all resolved and when we have a way forward, it's going to be huge breaking news and everybody in the country is going to suddenly know how it's changed. Realistically, I don't think that's going to be the case. So how can we educate those renters on the Renters' Rights Bill, or should we be now before it's even been passed? Graham, what's your view on that?
Yeah, look, Sarah, that whole part about asking the price of the taxi before you get in is the same thing that applies here, in my view. I think you've got to try and get as much clear information out there. And of course, I fully understand, a government perspective, which you'll say, but it's not law yet, right? But in reality, 97% 97% of it is going to go pretty much forward as it is. So, and the poor tenants in this, I mean, it's almost by luck that it's not coming in the middle of a student academic cycle, right? Because if it did, this would just be like a nuclear explosion in the market, so it seems fortunate that it's going to be post academic cycle start, but we've really got to get our act together. I'm almost tempted to say, why don't we start to convene, a group across all of interested parties, because you've got everything from NALA on one side of it looking after agents, you've got different groups and referencing companies, you've got universities, you've got embassies, for God's sake, all of those parties, I think should be trying to come together in some way, and I'd be quite happy, probably different way to even start to think about convening that, because I think it's so important that at least we start to get alignment. Even if we start to fragment and break into different sectors to do it, at least the interest is trying to make sure that the renter has got the right information, because otherwise you're just kicking the ball down the road and having problems later.
I think we are at a turning point with the bill, aren't we? Because up until probably now, effectively, it's more been lobbying rather than educating. Everyone in those independent sectors have been trying to implement the deal, put their parts across to have a way of potentially changing it for their own best interest. But we all know it's happening now. As you said, it's in the latter stages of the Lord. So the chances of last minute major amendments is pretty slim. There might be slight tweaking, but we're definitely at the stage now where we know roughly how this is going to look, and we're at the point now where it now needs to be educated to the wider public. Because I think you're right, Sarah, there'll be major headlines I expect of Section 21's now gone, but it won't educate tenants on how they need to serve their relevant notice. There'll be things about fixed terms ending, but not how periodics actually work. The headlines will be there, but not actually the down to earth outcomes from it.
And Graham, I think. Oh, sorry, go on, Nick.
Yeah, I was only going to say, just on that point, I think probably students might view this ability to give 2 months notice quite favourably in, say, HMOs, but whether, given the research that Housing Hand have done about this lack of knowledge about how to serve notice, well, that's one of my concerns, really, is that actually people won't, and they'll end up not serving notice and therefore not being able to leave. So I think it is important. And then just picking up on Graham's point, some kind of industry-wide sort of focus on this will be extremely helpful, I think.
I think one of the reasons why it would be so helpful, and Graham, you used the word alignment. Now, obviously, I'm a sales manager and I speak with different accommodation providers and embassies and booking partners every single day. It's part of my job. And it's quite interesting to see the different feedback we get on the Renters' Rights Bill from different people. And it's still quite interesting to see the knowledge that one person might have, somebody else might have a completely different view. So I think we all need to kind of have the same understanding, because it's well and good, obviously, providing tenants with information, but we need to make sure that we're giving them the right information and that we're not giving them conflicting information and one tenant is being told a different story to another tenant. So that is really, really important.
I wonder if that's been the distraction the whole way through, is that people have still been lobbying and challenging it and expecting there to be changes. So everybody's still got this, well, it might not happen, or there might be changes, and that's kind of preventing them preparing their tenants. Adam, are you speaking with your tenants about this, or are they coming to you with any questions? Is there any awareness out there that you can see?
Yeah, not so much with tenants, but it's really interesting for us because our conversations start with the landlords. That's where we start before we present those properties to the market. We're having discussions with our clients, even at the stage of before they buy a property. What are the pitfalls of the bill? Is it still profitable? That's the major question for lots of landlords at the moment. There's lots of conversations in Brighton at the moment about how the market will shift. Are we anticipating lots of tenants previously on fixed term 12 months to actually serve notice and leave after 10 when exams finish? Which we think many will, or will they stay for the summer because it's Brighton and we're quite lucky in that respect here in the summer. And landlords are having these conversations already about, will they push rents up to accommodate potential voids? Will they offer earlier start dates? Those are the conversations we are having. And we're getting to the stage now where we'll have to start presenting that to tenants now, because I think lots of tenants, there's some fantastic things in the bill and I think the premise for it is excellent. But again, I think it's it's not lost on me that some of the outcomes will be negative for tenants in many ways, and that's a really important thing to remember as well. And I think that's something we're starting to communicate a little bit, but the questions aren't coming from tenants at all yet. It's all from the landlord side.
Adam, I'm curious actually. Would you advise your landlords to bring forward the tenancy start date? So I've seen some agents starting to maybe suggest that that's a good idea. So maybe start it in June, so that you mitigate that risk of early termination. Is that something that you're starting to advise and see other agents advise on?
Yeah, exactly. Funny enough, we had an agent meeting in our office a few weeks ago with all the big providers in Brighton, and that's exactly what we're looking at doing. There's in the Brighton market, at least, there's going to be two primary models, which will be landlords who are happy with having HMOs tenanted for 10 months of the year, but probably for an increased rent to get the same amount over 12. That's more for properties where perhaps there's the option to Airbnb it or do something else in the summer months, or Mr. or Mrs. Landlord wants to come down and enjoy sunny Brighton in the summer themselves. And the other model, as you rightly say, Nick, which will be the predominant one, is properties will be offered earlier. And the reason why that works is because there is still a shortage of properties. And it's there's a general consensus between landlords and agents that if they offer their properties together for available for June and July move-ins, that's kind of tenants will have to take it or risk missing out on property. So you feel that voice. Yeah, that's the bit of a peek behind the curtain, but that's kind of the trend that Brighton's looking at for private market.
I know it's quite almost disappointing, the unforeseen consequences, I guess, as it's conveniently called, is that it's going to end up with, if those models go ahead, which are very practical, and I can understand that from an accommodation provider perspective, but the renter starting to want to rent in June when their courses aren't going to start until a little later, they might want their summer off before they start studying, so they're going to commit to something that they might not get. And then, as you say, the rent going up to compensate for a compressed potential period. We did some studies, and hence our void service that we're looking at introducing with the bill. Right? When we looked at defaults and when they happened, it was quite fascinating that, and we use that as a bit of a model for how compressed that period will be. And, our expectation is that there will be, probably 2 months at the back end of it. People will, either in anticipation or as the exams finish, right, then of course they're going to say, I'm out. Why would I pay more rent? But effectively, they are going to pay more rent.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, and I think it's, that's again a bit of an eye of the bill is in practical sense the student market, at least in our market where there is such undersupply of private accommodation, will in a couple of years' time be largely unchanged. There'll be slight changes to the logistics, but it will still be cyclical. Notices and things will change, but rents will go up as a result. And that is a real shame. I think, I'm sure we can get into debating some of the nuances of the bill, I suppose, but ultimately, landlords did need to adjust because the alternative was they don't find a solution that works and keeps their investment property viable. They leave the market, and that's arguably a worse outcome because then supply decreases even more. So, bills like this are always going to end up in some kind of halfway house because the market relies on providers and demand and supply, and those things have to balance, otherwise it will collapse.
And this is this change, as you introduced, Sarah. I mean, this is the first major transition for 35 years. In any other sector of the economy, if there was this like a type of transition, for 35 years, which is disruptive but also full of opportunity, on both sides of the equation, but people don't understand, and hence the survey.
I think the one thing that concerns me about everything that you just sort of described there, Adam, about the cycle is that the onus is now put back on the renter to give notice as well. And, that's, I think, students think in an academic cycle, and there's probably a lot of assumptions that it is fixed, and, I leave at the end of, my academic studies. But also if they're in a shared house, they need to understand, the obligations of everybody within that house. And it just feels like a lot of responsibility. I know it's meant to be for the renter, but, you do wonder if, well, clearly they weren't, students weren't properly considered. A lot of these are young, vulnerable people, that haven't lived on their own before. They're international students, they might be care leavers, etc. And suddenly, all of this responsibility is put back on them, really.
Yeah.
Nick, are you kind of seeing through your portal and your connections, really, any kind of concern about that, fixed term versus not fixed term conundrum?
So I think at this stage, not a lot of students are really aware of the forthcoming changes. But I think what we've noticed, particularly sort of since 2020, is we just get a lot more questions about, contract lengths, notice periods, what you can and can't do. Often, for example, international students who want to know whether they're able to cancel their contract if, for example, they don't get a visa. And obviously the complexities of that, because a lot of PBSAs will allow for it, whereas a HMO won't. So we already get a lot of these types of questions, and it's often, mostly what's on the student's mind, particularly for international students. And then that's one of my main concerns, really, is about being able to effectively communicate, what the situation is. And I think we were chatting before, and I think one of the things you picked up on as well is students that don't necessarily understand the difference between a PBSA and a HMO at the point they're booking. So, for example, in our search results, they're blended. So, because that's what students want. There might be 5 of them that want to share a cluster. I know cluster, we don't like that word, but they might want to share a cluster in a PBSA, or they might be open to a 5-bedroom HMO, and trying to explain what the difference might be between the two is quite complicated, actually.
Yeah, that's another unintended consequence, really, is a 2-tier
Yes.
system, really, and they're quite different. Just want to touch on something else. So I think part of the reason as well, Graham, why you wanted to do this, and you guys see it all the time, and I know you're very, very passionate about resolving disputes, getting tenants back on track. If they do default, that shouldn't be the end of the relationship. But I guess if we rewind, back to tenancy agreements, ASTs, all of this stuff, presumably a lot of what happens further down the road wouldn't ever happen if the education was better at the beginning. So surely it's in landlords and letting agents and PBSA providers' interest to make sure that their tenants have everything they need, because then you're not going to get this dispute further down the line.
Yeah, so you touch on something that is, so people look at a guarantor, to get them into property, as I talked about before, but keeping people in property or resolving things at the conclusion, right, seems to be part of our role too, because we act in parallel with the tenant. We have their interests at heart, really. So from an accommodation provider perspective, as long as an accommodation provider will meet what they put in the AST, or whatever that legal agreement will be, then we're quite happy to provide that cover. At the back end, though, when people either haven't paid their rent or they want to terminate early, that's where the challenges start, because we don't have a magic wand to say, oh, your legal agreement with the accommodation provider doesn't apply because you changed your mind. That's the cost of the getting out of the taxi, type of a scenario. We get very much involved in that. Now, legal landlords, as I would call them, because there are a few illegal that undermine the market, and the standards of this, I think, are fundamental. If an accommodation provider has done what they've said in their contract, then it's going to get enforced, and that's the issue. You've got to understand right up front what that really means. Now, is that going to change in terms of the contractual conditions that are applied? I doubt it. Right, so is getting knowledge on those and understanding that, in one sense, you might be able to give notice if you're in an HMO, right? Tough for an HMO to manage their tenancy length. PBSA is going to lock them in for whatever period that is, right? And that's a more traditional model. And understanding those differences, Sarah, is really difficult. We arbitrate, if you like, in many instances, to resolve that, and that's just part of our business model.
And Danny, what kind of situations, I guess, do you see from your accommodation providers that talk to you that you think probably could be resolved with better education? You know, now we know, I guess, what the missing gaps are as well.
Yeah, so I suppose a big one, which we've already touched on, is obviously tenants wanting to leave the property early. There are services out there for them, like I believe it's Spare Room, but it can be really difficult to actually use those and find suitable tenants that actually match with maybe, I don't know, people's cultures. And there's a number of different reasons for that. But as well as that, I do think that a lot of people just don't understand the fees as well. We seem to get a lot of problems where tenants that they don't quite understand how termly payments work or how the monthly payments work. So again, education pieces. I think the price of accommodation should be one of the first things that's nailed down before a tenant is actually signing the contract. So to me, it seems like a pretty obvious one, but obviously there is an underlying issue there. And again, education is what's needed to obviously break down that barrier.
Yeah, and Bill and Danny, I know we get a ton of different angles on this. The checkout process, and being able to, I think, Adam, as you talked about previously, getting the inventory right going in, and people go, yeah, I've got all those things, and they're not used to running their own kitchen and keeping things necessarily tidy. I mean, maybe their rooms at home are in that state anyway, but now they've got a responsibility because it's not theirs, it's someone else's that's being rented to them, and there's obligations to do that. So those damages and dilapidations and other things at the back end, and how it affects deposits, people don't understand.
I just want to go to the audience and just remind you that there is a Q&A button at the top of your screen, and we will get questions to our panelists to answer if you have them. We were lucky enough to get some questions actually emailed in before today's event, so we'll go to the email questions, but we're more than happy to get the live questions as well. So I'm gonna go through these in kind of no particular order, so feel free to answer them. There's a couple about trust and how to build trust, and Adam, don't take this the wrong way, but
I know what's coming, don't worry.
It could be said that estate agents, letting agents have a bit of a bad reputation, and I think what we see particularly in the survey between student tenants and working professional tenants, it does change. And it's like, actually, is that just changing because they learn, and they learn maybe from mistakes along the way? So I guess, what would you like to see in your industry really on that kind of education and trust side of things? Like you said, you're between, you're working for the landlord, you are, but you're front of house, you're forward facing with the tenant as well.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for all estate agents needing to be trained and qualified. Not quite an American-esque style, but close to it. We're an industry which, there are a lot of people like myself who make a career of this, but there's also a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, will enter the profession because it's an easy job straight out of college or school. And we're talking about quite complicated legal situations here, and there will be a lot of agents who don't have a clue. And they're the ones entrusted with lining up tenancies for where someone's going to live, and also a landlord's income, which are pretty big decisions. And dare I say, it's only going to get easier for agents to either deliberately or through naivety give false information, because there is such a lack of supply of properties and increased demand. It's so easy to let properties, so the need to be transparent isn't there, or at least from their perspective might not be there. And so I think agents being qualified and regulated is a must, because it's big decisions we're making for people's livelihoods, both tenant and the landlord side. And we are the first face. We're the one facilitating those deals. And so we are the people who, in my opinion, should be giving that information out. And it's also an education for landlords, is what we try to do, is seeing it as a balanced equation, because you need to educate those tenants correctly on what they're moving into, because if they default partway through, or you don't find the right tenants, or you don't set their expectations right, it is going to end up in a bad situation for the landlord. through damages or arrears or these kind of situations. So yeah, if we're moving towards a fair sector, I think agents need to have a long, hard look at themselves. We do this. We've done this a long time ago. We're very good at what we do. But I wish every agent was like us.
Yeah, I mean, full transparency, I was one of those university leaver estate agents. And, I love the profession and I love what I did, but I don't think it's really changed. And, I left school, 20 plus years ago. And it's not really changed. So, yeah, I think most people would welcome that kind of regulation as well. And actually, it's getting more complicated. So surely that is necessary. It shouldn't be an easy job, really, because it is so complicated, and like you said, it impacts so many people's lives in a very, very significant way.
Yeah, I think I don't want to throw any insults, because if we've got any young letting agents on the call with us watching here, it's an opportunity for you. By learning these things, learning the laws, that's how you become very good at what you do, because you can give the best possible advice to your tenants and your landlords. You're right, the landlords are the clients, but the moment you damage your reputation on the tenant side, it's a long road back to regain that trust. And it's a good opportunity for agents to educate themselves and stand out from the crowd, and that's what we're doing. That's why we're so on the front foot with the bill, because knowing these things puts you apart from the crowd. I don't call myself an estate agent when people ask me what I do. I'm a property professional. That's only partly through shame, but it's because we like to do things a bit differently.
I love that.
and Adam, I applaud that. That's a tough question, Sarah, to throw.
Yeah.
but actually, that's a fantastic response, because in parallel with that, again, as a guarantor, the only reason that you want a guarantor is that they're going to be there with you when you need them. Right? There's no point in paying anybody any money at all, right, as a professional guarantor, if they're not going to pay out, if they're not going to help you in that journey. And if they don't pay out, you're going to end up with a liability and the bill of a guarantor. It's crazy. So for us, that whole payout, and I can't remember, Danny, you're going to have to tell me, how much we have settled over the last few years.
So it's actually £3.4 million worth of claims over the last 3 years, which is a staggering number.
I love the way that Graham pretended he didn't actually know that.
He's testing me.
Just as an aside, Sarah, a really quick one. And one of my frustrations around that reputation piece has been this assumption that student landlords are all bad. And that's been really frustrating because, they're one of the arguments why they can't sort of get involved in the codes is because they need sort of harsher regulation or strict control. All of our research shows that the majority of students who live in landlord operated properties are very satisfied, and I know that aligns with Unipol as well. The majority of student landlords are excellent. It's that the small minority really that cause the issues, and I think that it's just really difficult to overcome that kind of almost blanket assumption that landlords are all bad.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, Nick. I mean, we work with a lot of landlords, and 99.9%, in fact, all of them, because if they're not a good landlord or they don't have the right mindset, we wouldn't work with them. And it's, as you say, it's that trust level though, because be it through parents or university bodies, rightly or wrongly, putting almost the findings of the report suggesting that there is a distrust from tenants towards all sorts of people in the industry. They come into that relationship with a distrust, and I don't blame them. I understand it from previous track records, but it's just a crying shame, isn't it? Because when you're trying to genuinely help someone, or a landlord is offering a particular accommodation, there's only so much you can say to build that trust, and then eventually they have to take the plunge and let you show it.
Yeah, and it is that consistency, and which is the follow through, all the time. And it's not one time, is you have to continue to work at it.
Absolutely.
And I think that a lot of the absence of that information available about renting is probably building that distrust. If you don't know something when you're going into something, you're going to distrust it regardless of whether that's someone's fault or not, because you haven't got the information to hand. So I think what the research has proven, what this conversation is proving, is that actually it's so important that we get that central source of information. So actually when people go into this process, that they actually have all the information needs, they go into it confidently, so they can trust the process, so they can trust the people that they're dealing with and talking to.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to come back to something that both Nick and Adam were touching on earlier, and that is timing. People frequently, as I think, Danny, you were saying about trying to get, their property, and now they're in a rush because there's scarcity, lack of supply, or huge competition, whichever of those, but people rush into things, and it's not a healthy way of actually engaging in what is quite an obligation. And that for me is fundamental. Is how can you get further up the channel, if you like, in terms of that decisioning process. So Sarah, you was asking about who should be involved in things, and I think yes, for students, universities, embassies, if they're international particularly, need to be out there, and even the different portals that find students or people from overseas. They've got to be part of it too, but unfortunately not all of them are in the same level of interest.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Deanie, I think you've got some questions that we're going to go to now live as well.
I am, yes. I'm just looking at these questions. So we've got one from Yelena Robertson Keeler. It says, Danny mentioned about termly payments. We always build them in the contract to assist tenants to understand what they need to pay, but it's not very clear if we'll be able to build the termly payment schedule in the tenancy agreements once the bill passes. We understand that the upfront payments are prohibited, but it is said before tenancy is exited, so that is very clear. Has anyone got any more understanding around kind of the termly payment schedule and what will happen once the bill passes?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yes, please, Graham.
Some current understanding, which I think is 98% certain, is that PBSAs will pretty much be able to do whatever payment mechanism they want, but HMOs won't be able to do that. It's only monthly payments with the first month and a deposit in play. You won't be able to do termly payments. Now, the subtlety, I think, Deanie, of the question is also at the time of the tenancy agreement. I understand there's a nuance, and we take a lot of legal advice, that if you enter into a tenancy agreement on that basis, 1 month and the deposit, as a HMO, so lots of qualifications here, then after that, you could, as a tenant, should you wish, decide to say, I'd like to pay some of my rent up front. Now, the accommodation provider can't insist, but after the contract has been executed, we understand that that's not illegal. Right, but then it can't be part of a tenancy agreement, and you'd have to think about, you're advancing monies to people that, what's the basis of that, and there's going to have to be a side agreement and other things. So I think there's some nuance with it. You might be able to get there, but ultimately the government, I think, is trying to stop it happening. So just it's one of those buyer beware things that, you might think you can get around things now, right? But the government's reserved the right to change things as they move forward. So if they see that someone's being clever, or short-termist about things, then you might find those things are blocked quite quickly.
Cool, thank you. And we've got another question as well, which is, there was a recent mention from Good Lord at a committee stage. It was discussed that there are talks about an exemption of student HMOs from the bill, allowing fixed-term contracts for students, which was issued in the 15th of May. Have you heard this similar feedback?
No, that didn't get passed in Parliament. Committees, I've learned a lot about Parliament as we've gone through this, and all sorts of things regarding that law process. But the committee stage in the Lords actually involves all the Lords. So it's not literally a committee, it's all the Lords are debating all the clauses. So it's quite a lengthy process and lots of opinions. But that there's a paper which came out on the 21st, I think a couple of days ago, which is the final part going to what they call the report stage, which is the report from the Lords into the Commons, which then says, this is what we suggest. But that didn't get passed. That didn't, I think, even get a real debate.
I think there was a tweak, and you might correct me on this, Graham, so I hope I'm right. But after the initial white paper, this was a while ago now, I think we said at the Commons that for student accommodation, there's a HMO test or a student test, which it must be a HMO, it must be all full-time students at the onset of the agreement. And I think it's called a section 4A, I believe, which means you can still thank you very much. We can still repossess the property once a year. So at the onset, when you sign that tenancy agreement, you can still have a clear line in the sand for an end date. The tenants still have the option to serve notice up until that date, but you have effective hard stop should you need it as a provider or landlord.
Yeah, and Adam, totally right. But who as a tenant would understand the ground 4A at this point in time? I mean, that's another part of this.
Okay, thank you all. We're going to go to the last question now to each of the panelists. So we haven't got long left, so keep it brief. So to summarise, what is your top piece of practical advice for the audience based on everything we've talked about today and everything that you've read in the report? I'm going to go to you first, Danny.
I think a plan needs to be strategized, and I think we need to take this survey as an education piece for ourselves, not just the tenants. And we actually need to put ourselves in their shoes and just understand what your tenants' needs actually are. And maybe just a simple question is, do you understand how a deposit works? Do you understand what a guarantor is? Because the amount of times that we obviously speak to people, and the questions, like I said earlier, they seem simple to us, but they really are confusing for the renters. So I think just collating some of the information together and just offering that assistance if it's needed, it's just absolutely key and vital at the moment.
Yeah, I agree with that, Danny. And I think, from a marketing point of view, all the answers are in your survey. So if I was an accommodation provider with a website, whether I was a letting agent or PBSA or BTR, I would just go through and think, well, hold on, these are the frequently asked questions. The tenants have told us what they don't understand. So it feels like actually that's the first step, is just actually making sure that the answers to all those questions are readily available. And I guess to Adam's comment before, that staff are trained on it as well, that it can't just be a piece of paper that gets dished out. People need to actively engage with it. Yeah. Adam, what's your piece of practical advice?
I think it's remembering that a fair sector is needed for everybody, regardless of where you're coming at it, whether you're an accommodation provider or a service provider or a landlord or a tenant. We all need this to work for it to work. To use Graham's analogy, if you're getting a taxi, you need to make sure that you leave the taxi clean and tidy. If you want to keep getting that service, if you're a taxi driver, you need to make sure you charge a reasonable fare. We all need to collaborate, otherwise I'm not going to say sector collapses, but we all need things to work for various different reasons. And I think, if you're worried about the bill, or even if you disagree with parts of it, it's just knowing it's there for a reason, and it is a good thing. Whether we agree or disagree with how it's being implemented, the idea is to make it fairer, and no one can ever argue that making the sector fairer is a bad thing.
Well, that taxi analogy is good, isn't it? Legs, like we're loving that. Thank you, Adam. Graham, what's your piece of practical advice?
I guess really simple. This is going to get more confusing before it gets more simple. And I think we've got a lot of hard work to answer those frequently asked questions. I think you're right, Danny, that that's part of the key, but we've all got different views of it. So communication, we've got to get right, but it's communication to the tenant and the people that are up that supply, that funnel of application. So I think it's as much international. We see a huge influx of internationals despite immigration rules and things like that. They're being a bit more eased, but we've got to try and communicate in different languages and clearly. Otherwise, this is going to take a while to unravel.
Perfect. And finally, Nick.
Yeah, I think really simple for me really is be positive. I think we are where we are. So I think now as a sector, we should just try and be as positive as possible and present this as an opportunity. It's happening, so let's be positive about it.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Deanie now.
Lovely. And thank you, everyone. That was a brilliant discussion and I learned a lot. And I think, there's obviously much more we need to do about communicating. Graham, I'm looking forward to you bringing together those group of people to kind of build that that centre of communication. And a big thank you to obviously our panel of experts. It was great to have you all here today, and to everyone that joined us today or is watching this back on the recording. Special thanks to Housing Hand for inviting us to host this very key webinar. We hope the advice and information has been useful, and the topics discussed will help you understand your tenants a bit more. It's clear that by supporting tenants through the challenging times, it will help us to mitigate potential problems in the future. So that is important. Please do make sure you follow Housing Hand for more information and advice on their LinkedIn page. And if you haven't already been to download that report, please make sure you do via their website, because you will find it fascinating and interesting. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.